All right, welcome. Back with your boy and your girl. You know who it is. You know who it be? It's your boy, Sigismund Freud. Freud? Do you know Plato and Freud? Remember Bill and Ted?
Yeah. And Socrates
Socrates and Freud.
and
And,
Beethoven.
yeah, Beethoven and Caslewis.
Yes. And he says, all we are is dust in the wind, dude.
Dude. Who would win in a fight? Sigmund Freud or Caslewis?
Probably C.S. Lewis.
Okay.
Yeah. Freud
All
seemed
we
kind of...
are is dust in the wind, dude.
Yup.
Oh, all right. I got my coffee. Got my fiance. What's up, Jamie? How you doing?
I'm great. Glad to be here. This should be fun.
Yes, you had a great idea to read this book that was popular a couple years ago. I guess it's still somewhat popular. It's a course taught at Harvard. Tell us about this book.
Yeah, this is a book we found at the one hippie store in Murray.
Mm-hmm.
And it still smells like patchouli every time I open it. But
And that hippie store smells like urine now. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, urine and patchouli.
Yeah, man. You know, Boomer Garcia, man. He's always hanging out at the hippie store in Murray. I won't name it. We don't want to get, a lawsuit going with the hippie store there. But, they're big Grateful Dead fans in there, man,
It is a pretty authentic hippie store, though. I gotta say,
they really are Boomer.
Like,
it's really Boomer. That dude is
and...
Boomer Garcia that owns that.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah. It's dirty and miskept, and lots of incense going on everywhere. And
it doesn't just smell like
records.
patchouli; it smells like patootie in there.
Yeah, definitely.
So tell us about this C.S. Lewis book. This is a what's the comparison here? These two heavyweights on God, life, and love.
Yeah, this book is actually written by a professor who teaches this course at Harvard Medical School for the last 30 years. So he found that it was such a popular course with his students that he kept on going for us. So you are getting a Harvard level education tonight. Philosophical discussion on morality and psychology, life and love.
Not sure a Harvard level education means a whole lot, because I saw Harvard graduate surveys a few years ago, and they all believe the most normie, stupid bullshit. So
yeah,
I'm not so sure that a Harvard education means a whole lot, other than just that you're connected to a bunch of other douchebags.
Well, I'm pretty sure this author is Christian, Dr. Armand M. Nikolai Jr.
Yeah, probably.
That's the professor. So he's coming at it from I think he's on C.S. Lewis' side, obviously. So.
Okay. So how do we want to start out? By the way, this will be a 2-part lecture. This is, as usual, if you want access to the full analysis and talks and gritty, cutting-edge work that we do, you can subscribe to Jay's analysis at the website in the subscription sections, or you can subscribe here at the join buttons on YouTube. Help support me and Jamie, and we would love to have you on board with our team. We're team players. We want you as a team member.
Yep.
That's my corporate spill.
Wait. Is it too noisy? Can you hear that train?
Is that a train? Or is that your inner monologue?
Those are my thoughts.
Okay, no, it's fine. Go ahead. So tell us, where do you want to start?
Well, it's interesting because he puts these two people contrasting each other, because he has gone to great lengths to make the point that it's so important that we have a worldview before we start our education.
Yes.
Because that's going to dictate everything we do. So he says our worldview informs our personal, social, political lives. It influences how we perceive ourselves, how we relate to others, how we adjust. It determines our values, ethics, and capacity for happiness. So that's really important that we have a cohesive worldview so that we know where to begin our education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is something that we try to do at my site, is try to give a lot of people, a solid grounding in a coherent worldview. That's really the goal. The goal of apologetics is, of course, not just to win debates, but to also give people grounding in a worldview, and that's what we try to do when we, try to offer, as Father Deacon Ananias does, courses in logic, the tutoring that I do, the work that I've done the last 5 years, all the globalism books talks, the various debates. It's all geared towards getting grounded in a solid worldview. So I like that guy is coming from that perspective, and he understands that a lot of people have their worldviews smashed, their paradigm smashed in a bad way when they go to college. So he's right about that. I mean, that's kind of what the university system is there to do, is to kind of smash your worldview in a bad way.
Yeah. Break you down, make you question everything so that they can...
Yeah, but not in a good way. In a way that you can then be spoon-fed all the sort of establishment BS.
Yes, that's why you see so many communist groups coming out of universities and socialist groups.
I would say so. Right? Yeah, that's what they try to sell people on, is that sort of normie level. Mm-hmm. Marxism, socialism. That's not even Marxism, socialism, historically speaking. It's some kind of weird, I don't know what it is, some kind of weird cult thing, basically. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
So he starts out the book. The first part is titled, "What Should We Believe?" And he is discussing how important Freud's work is to the beliefs of the 20th century in psychology and how we view the world. And he says that Freud's scientific contributions are equal to Einstein. He is 6th in a book on the 100 most influential scientists. His photo is on the Austrian currency.
Interesting.
Words like,
That's interesting, because the narrative that you get now, is that Freud has kind of been surpassed. He's not as relevant anymore, but I guess he achieves his purpose, so he can be dispensed with, right?
Yeah, well, he says historians call the 20th century the quote century of Freud.
Interesting.
Words like ego, repression, complex, projection, neurosis.
You have an ego repression complex that's causing a neurosis.
Yes. Those are all things that are everyday terms now, but these are all coined by Freud.
How many cigars do you give the C.S. Lewis Freud book?
I give it 7.5 cigars and a brandy.
Ooh, that's dirty, phallic. No, I'm kidding. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. What else? Freud obviously is on the side of advocating the atheistic philosophy. And then what else? Oh, Time magazine called Freud the most influential... No, C.S. Lewis called C.S. Lewis the most influential spokesman for the spiritual worldview. So...
Yeah, I think that's a good comparison. Like, who are the two figures that represent two different paradigms for the 20th century? So, right. Yeah, I guess that is an interesting choice. I don't agree with, obviously, all of C.S. Lewis's theology being Anglican, but in many ways, he came close to orthodoxy in many ways. So we have a lot of appreciation for C.S. Lewis. I like the Space Trilogy. I like Narnia a lot. I like
many of my Orthodox friends are big C.S. Lewis fans, have degrees in C.S.
Right.
Lewis.
My godfather is a big C.S. Lewis fan. I mean, The Great Divorce is really good. Some of his other theological stuff I'm not a huge fan of, but he even has, there's a transcendental argument in C.S. Lewis to a degree. So we have a lot of appreciation here at the Jay's Analysis Circle for C.S. Lewis as well.
Yep. So it's interesting that C.S. Lewis, his success as a writer came after his conversion from atheist to believer. So he didn't have any notoriety or any creative success or anything like that until after he made this giant change in his belief. He started out as atheist. Let's see. Freud's childhood, they both had very hard childhoods. but Freud's nanny would take him to church, to a Catholic church.
Mm-hmm.
And so he kind of got a distaste and a appreciation at the same time for religion. And he always had this attraction to Rome. So he was very into like Roman history and the Pope and Catholicism, even though he wasn't Christian.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know that about him.
Yeah. So it says here he disliked music, but he had strange attraction to Rome and unusual awareness of the holidays, the Easter holidays, and the Christmas. So that made a big impact on him.
He disliked music. Who dislikes music?
Yeah, I know. Isn't that strange?
Seriously, I mean, something's wrong there. Who dislikes music? I met one person in my life that said they dislike music, and then they later changed their mind. I guess when they heard some. What?
Yeah, that's strange. What a character. He actually escaped the Nazis in Vienna in 1939 with the help of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and fled to London. He studied under a philosopher. I don't know if you've heard of this guy, Franz Brentano.
Absolutely. I have Brentano over on my shelf because he's relevant to phenomenology and intentionality. He's the father for the idea of intentionality. Absolutely.
What is that? It's
an idea in philosophy borrowed from medieval and Aristotelian thought that you just, when you are looking at objects in the world or doing any action in the world, you have an intention towards some object. You pick out some object. So.
Was Brentano a theist?
No.
Christian?
No, he was a adherent, I think, of psychologism.
Oh, okay. So then some other famous philosophers he was connected to was Feuerbach, Feuerbac, Feuerbach, who was a student of Hegel. So it goes Hegel, Feuerbach, Freud, just like that.
Right. So Brentano is also in the psychologistic, materialistic, empiricist tradition, which would make sense why. Because Feuerbach is an atheist, so you could see why these would be people amenable to what Freud is doing.
Mm-hmm. Freud's dad was Jewish, and he read the Bible regularly at home in Hebrew.
The Bible or the Talmud? Or we don't know.
It just said the Bible, so probably the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
But he did not have a lot of respect for his dad. Therefore, he did not have a lot of respect for religion. He was very sensitive to anti-Semitism.
Did it say why he didn't have respect for his dad?
Because he saw his dad being, what's the word for bullied? I guess bullied by anti-Semitic people, and he didn't stand up for himself, so he always thought of his dad as kind of like a pushover loser.
So Freud had daddy issues. How meta is that?
Yes. Well, he goes into that, definitely.
Mm-hmm. But now, was his mom Jewish, or was he just his dad? So,
yeah, just his dad.
So he's not technically.
And his dad Jewish. Was much older than his mom.
Okay.
He believed that the basis of humans' worship of God was connected to the Oedipus complex.
Okay. So and why is that related to God? Explain it.
That you get your ideas of who God is and what he's like by observing your father. Mm-hmm. And then when you grow up and find out that your father is just a human, or you like projected all of these qualities on him that weren't true, that is just wishful thinking.
Yeah. And that fits in with Feuerbach, because Feuerbach says that about God.
So he goes on to pose the question, do early family relationships predispose us toward or away from belief in God? And I would say, yeah, definitely your family has a lot to do with how you view God the Father because of your own father.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. It makes perfect sense. I mean, a father is an icon of God the Father, so yeah.
Yes. So then Lewis's background, his mom died when he was young. he prayed for her to get better, and when she didn't, he was disappointed in God. So that's a pretty common thing that turns people away from God, where they don't know how they feel and they ask for something, it doesn't happen, and they say, well, God isn't real, right? So that's kind of what happened to C.S. Lewis. He was sent to a school where the headmaster was both a religious person and a violent person, so that shaped his worldview when he was very young. He had a female teacher who he really liked, who would talk to him about occultism. So in his impressionable years, one of the adults that he felt like he could trust and that was a kind person was also dabbling in the...
You're talking about C.S. Lewis now.
Spiritism. Yeah, C.S. Lewis.
So he had a mentor who was was she a witch? What was she?
It didn't say witch, it just said female teacher, but it did say she was into all the occult, esoteric things, and they would talk about them.
Okay.
So he was influenced by that. He did not like his boarding school. He had a very tough time with the snobbery and...
More like boring school, am I right?
School numbs my buns.
to quote Audrey Horne, yes.
Yeah, he said, I have never seen a community so competitive, so full of snobbery and flunkyism, a ruling class so selfish and self-conscious, or a proletariat so fawning and lacking in solidarity and sense of corporate honor. So he did not have a lot of good things to say about the boarding school where he went to.
Shocker. I mean, yeah, I can't imagine that the UK elite would be considered degenerate and disgusting. Can you believe that? Now, what school was he at? Cambridge?
This was before he went to college. This was his the boarding
or was he?
school.
Did he go to Oxford? I guess he was at Oxford.
Yeah, Oxford.
Yeah, okay.
They both went.
Go ahead.
So let's see. Lewis based his atheism on the book The Golden Bow.
Golden Bough by Sir James Fraser.
Bow. Yeah, which that's one of the biggest books that talks about how Christianity is just
comparative religion.
Myth.
It's like the zeitgeist of the 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. He went to war at age 19. So that's pretty heavy and devastating to a young person.
Mm-hmm.
And then let's see what else. Talking about, so that's their backgrounds. That's their early childhoods before they went to college. Freud starts to get into psychology, and he divides all people into two categories, believers and unbelievers. And then he goes on about the scientific worldview, which he thought his worldview was, quote, scientific because of its premise that knowledge comes only from research. Of course, this basic premise cannot itself be based on scientific research,
right?
Is what the book is saying. Rather, it is
so this guy's making a presuppositional critique of Freud. I like that. That's the very thing that we would do. And that's, by the way, why I mentioned a kind of a transcendental argument in C.S. Lewis. You probably see me tweet out that image. I've tweeted it out 4 or 5 times, put it on Instagram, where we see C.S. Lewis basically making this type of a transcendental argument about consciousness. So go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he says, can't be based on scientific research. Rather, it is a philosophical assumption that cannot be proven. One can only assume that all knowledge comes from research and that no knowledge comes from revelation.
Yeah, so there's an assumption of naturalism, and of course, naturalism will underlie the totality of this scheme that Freud is up to here.
Mm-hmm. Freud believed that religion was a mass delusion, which he called the universal obsessional neurosis, which he likened to obsessive compulsive disorder with prayers and chanting and stuff like that. So he literally thinks that believing in God is a mental illness.
Right. Yeah, you could see how this could be amenable to communists. I mean, Freud didn't have a Marxist type view, did he?
It didn't say.
Okay. You could see how this would be amenable to Marxism, though, because it gives you. I mean, other philosophers have noticed that the premier kind of anti-civilization forces people like Marx, Darwin, and Freud, these three figures, pretty much demolished not just Western civilization, but civilization or Christendom as a whole, you could say. And part of the reason that they were able to do that was all three have the underlying presupposition of naturalism, but also making the point that you're making right now.
Mm-hmm. So Lewis, on the other hand, he was atheist for 30 years. His conversion was a slow, we'll talk about that more in detail, but it was a more of a process for him. But it did start when he was going to Oxford. He experienced a radical change. It says a change from atheism to belief based on the Old and New Testaments through a series of discussions with faculty members whose intelligence he greatly respected. So that's really important to have Christians in academia, because you can make converts that way, right?
Yeah, I mean, until I went into academia, I realized how awful academia is. But maybe in his day it was a little better. I don't know. But,
it says, through the reading of certain authors over a period of many years, Lewis came to a firm belief in the creator of a universe, but also a belief that the creator stepped into human history.
Right. So the incarnation is key here. So what we want to stress here is two different paradigms, two different worldviews. So from the outset, as the author appears to notice, we don't just have two conflicting interpretations of the same evidence. We have two different paradigms that are completely contrary to one another. One, materialistic, atheistic, Darwinistic, basically attempting to explain everything according to base desires and impulses, namely Freud. And then we have the perspective that is looking to the transcendent, looking to a higher level of order, looking to metaphysics with C.S. Lewis. And so you couldn't have, a greater contrast of these two positions than what we see in these two figures.
And not only was he converted to believing in God, he was converted to believing in the Christian incarnation of God. So not just like, I admit there's a higher power, but he believed in Jesus.
Right. And C.S. Lewis got better and better over time. And, unfortunately, he didn't become Orthodox, but he probably would have if he'd have continued, because he was getting closer to orthodoxy. But yeah, so it's a good choice with Lewis again, because it's not some generic. There's probably some higher power, but specifically a type of theism that is particular. So exactly.
Yeah. Then they talk about believing in God and having questions like, well, if God exists, how come there's evil? How come bad things happen? These are questions that...
problem of evil, it always comes up.
Yeah. So Lewis says God created things which had free will, and free will made evil possible. God didn't create evil, but free will makes evil possible, is the answer.
Yeah.
Right?
Evil is not a thing that exists. It's a movement of the will away from the good. It's not some kind of subsistent being that would be dualistic or Manichaean. So we don't give evil any kind of substantial ontological being. It's just a term for moving the will, turning away from the good, and namely the highest good, God. So yeah, but in Freud, evil takes on a so-called scientific explanation, which ironically, again, nowadays, a lot of this would be called pseudoscience, right? So what Freud thought was like this perfectly scientific explanation of human motivations and desires, nowadays is called pseudoscience, but it's all predicated on naturalism and scientism, which is very easy to debunk.
Right. So Freud has two main arguments against the existence of God. One, the psychological argument that he calls wish fulfillment. Just,
I don't know what that is.
God doesn't exist just because you miss your daddy, basically, and you want something to pray to because you feel alone in the universe. That doesn't mean God exists. And then the other, what we just talked about, was the argument concerning human suffering. Why is there suffering? So these are two main things that kept Freud from believing in God.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, problem of evil is always one that people fall back on. Of course, you're not you don't actually get a solution to this problem in the other paradigms where you make evil into just some sort of neurosis or psychological drive. It doesn't actually provide any explanation. It gives the appearance of an explanation, but it actually still has all the your worldview still has all the same problems that you expect the theist paradigm to have.
Mm-hmm.
This is just an irony that you don't actually escape the problem of quote unquote of evil. You can redefine it, but it still doesn't have any coherent explanation or make any sense, because in that worldview of naturalism, nothing makes sense or is coherent because nothing really means anything. I mean, ultimately the universe
It's all chaos, man.
yeah, ultimately the universe is meaningless, and that means that your life ultimately is meaningless, and that means that your experience this week was meaningless, and that means that your day today is meaningless, and that means that all the sentences that you say are also meaningless.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
all the books that you wrote are meaningless too.
So Freud's writing about the projection of human needs, our deep-seated wishes that we project onto our concept of God, and they stem from early childhood. Human child's long drawn-out helplessness and need of help makes us conjure up a figure like the one who protected us as a child.
Yeah, this is logically speaking. This is also, I should mention, fallacious. So the fact that people have wishes or desires or drives for something to be the case doesn't prove or disprove a thing. So I might wish for there to be rain tomorrow, and in fact, it does rain tomorrow, but my wishing for it to rain tomorrow really didn't have anything to do with the fact that it rained tomorrow. So you see that wishing something or wanting or desiring something really is irrelevant to the truth or falsity of that thing. That should be obvious, but actually when we get into a lot of these characters who are enmeshed in scientism, I mean, they don't even know basic logic, nor do they even care. Although they tout reason and logic all the time, they actually just constantly engage in fallacies. So just saying that something like that means that religion is false is actually a fallacy. Is that true? I'm not sure about that.
Well, like we just were talking about, we do get our sense of justice and wrong and fairness from our parents, and they can turn us one way or the other towards
I mean,
God
it seems
or
like there's
against
some
God.
correlation causation fallacy too here. Maybe like just because people are rebellious when they're teenagers or something like that, does that mean, how does that prove anything metaphysically? It doesn't.
It doesn't. No.
So
This
what
is
I'm
all
saying is that
Freud's.
Freud seems to be making a lot of leaps here that are not sound, that are not justified.
So he thinks the God is formed in the likeness of the Father, and his personal relation to God depends on the relation of the Father in the flesh and oscillates and changes along with that relation. Psychoanalysis infers that he really is the Father with all the magnificence in which he once appeared to the small child. And we can't, when we grow up, we just make up another father, basically. And that's what religion is, according to Freud. He says God does not create us in his image, we create God in our parents' image. Hello?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the different ways that this is an invalid move in terms of philosophy. It's also kind of an appeal to emotion. This is a move that a lot of atheists love to use, where they'll say that the only reason that you believe this is because you have a weakness in your character. You have a desire for some powerful figure that you can look to. You have the desire to have some higher archetype that makes you feel strong so that you can avoid being weak, and you're scared of facing the fact that reality is meaningless and everything's just matter in motion. That's actually an appeal to emotion, which is again a fallacy, because actually, that has nothing to do with whether it's true or false, right? I mean, people could appeal to emotions for things that are facts, right? And they might believe in something that's a fact on the basis of emotion, or they might deny something that's a fact on the basis of emotion. But the emotional motivations, again, they don't have anything to do with the truth or falsity of the thing itself. I mean, if I'm like, if I decide that the number 7 hurts my feelings and it makes me cry, right? Is that a valid argument? Like, there are no number 7s because they make me cry. China doesn't exist because it makes me angry. I'm angry at the existence of China, so therefore it doesn't exist. Anyone who believes in China, that it exists, is a shill. You're a shill.
You're just projecting.
Right, that would be an appeal to a weird form of an appeal to emotion / ad hominem or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
But as you can see, those are obviously fallacious. And so what I see here with Freud is really a basic fallacy. But as we often see, basic fallacies entrap so many people. So many are entrapped by very basic moves that are logically fallacious. And that's because propaganda works the best when it's kept at the most simple level.
So Lewis's counterpoint to Freud's wish fulfillment argument is that the biblical worldview involves a great deal of despair and pain and is certainly not anything one would wish for. Lewis said, "It does not begin in comfort, it begins in dismay, and it's no use at all trying to go on to that comfort without first going through the dismay of realizing how far short one falls of meeting the Creator's standards and how much one needs alteration. One can never experience the comfort of belief." So he's basically saying when you are converted or you're convicted, it doesn't make you comfortable. It makes you super uncomfortable because you know your fate and you know you need to repent and change, and you see.
Yeah, this is an instant. I mean, it's not the best reply to Freud's argument. It's okay. I mean, you could meet Freud.
Yeah.
You could meet Freud on his own grounds. I would have gone for a presuppositional critique of the whole nonsense system, but I don't think C.S. Lewis was that sophisticated in his apologetic. Not to say he's a bad guy, but yeah, I mean, it is an interesting repost to say that, well, actually, you're not always made more comfortable by religion. People don't just adopt religious beliefs to have some emotional feeling of comfort. There might be some that might be involved in people's motivations, but to smush that down into a reductionist, one-dimensional definition of religion is again not true.
Let's see. He says an atheist also has a strong wish that God does not exist. So it could be the same thing. You wish for God to exist, or you wish for him not to exist.
Right, that's a good point. Yeah, you could turn that argument around and say that I could just say that, well, you are afraid of God existing, so you have an emotional movement to deny God's existence. That's a good point. An emotional motivation, I should say. Excuse me.
Yeah. So he is talking again about both Lewis and Freud's negative feelings towards their fathers. Like we were talking about before, Freud saw his father as a weak failure, and Lewis saw his father as wild and ill-tempered, violent, pathetic, and comic.
Interesting. So 2 different views of their fathers?
2 different negative views of their fathers that both led them to believe in atheism.
Interesting. So they both had negative fatherly appraisals and went in different directions. That is interesting.
Exactly.
By the way, I want to remind everybody that we are taking super chats. If you want to support us, you can ask super chat questions. We will read those here in a little bit. We got a few of those already. Thank you guys for those super chats. You can also subscribe to my channel to support what I do. Welcome to Travis Kraft, the big name YouTuber who's in the chat. Shout out to Travis. You're welcome. Glad you're here. I saw you subscribe the other day. Much appreciated. Everybody, if they would, check out Travis's material. He's got an interesting channel, deals with a lot of men's issues, philosophy, this kind of stuff. Cool guy. And then we got some super chats we'll read here in a little bit. I want to remind you that part 2 of this will be for subscribers. So if you want to hear the full chat, which will be up in a couple days, you can subscribe to my channel or to my website, jaysanalysis.com. And I apologize, I have not forgot the final installment for subscribers to Genesis. I promise you that in the next few days that will be complete. And then Jamie and I will do part 2 of this talk for subscribers on Thursday. So where are we at? By the way, hit like and share. Everybody hit like and share. Much appreciated.
Even though Freud was anti-religious, he openly quoted from the Bible a lot in his letters. He would say things like, I passed my test with God's help, or
well, the Bible's full of archetypes. There's a lot of archetypes there that are relevant.
The good Lord, taking the Lord to task, and the keeping of the Lord. So he would always put God in his letters, even though he said he didn't believe in him. So it was on his mind.
Depends on what you mean by God.
Yeah. Right. And Lewis admitted that when he was an atheist, his life was full of contradictions and a very unhappy person.
What does it say? What kinds of contradictions, or what did he mean? In his worldview, or did he say how he viewed those contradictions?
Yeah, we'll get into that. Okay. This is just like kind of an overview of both of their lives. So, they were each rebelling against their father. They both had a problem with authority. But Freud spoke religious. Oh, here's my note. You know, like how the MGTOW guys like say that they're going their own way and they hate women and they don't want them. Mm-hmm. But all they do is like talk about it. Mm-hmm. That's how Freud was with God in his atheism.
So God was living rent-free in Freud's head, Freud's noggin.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So he's going his own way and he's going against God, but all he does is like think about it.
Yeah. Well, Nietzsche talked about that, the evangelical atheists who, they're more evangelical than evangelicals. It's pretty, he made fun of them. It's pretty funny. And he's accurate. Nietzsche was right about that.
They both had a very low opinion of people.
The pale atheists. C.S. Lewis had a low opinion of people?
In his atheist
in his atheism phase. Well, every atheist has a low opinion of people because they're the smartest, most greatest, most euphoric gentlemen, miladies of all time. Right?
Yeah.
How can you not be better than everybody if you're totally euphoric?
Yeah. Freud believed the human race would eventually outgrow the need for belief through education. So there's another stupid idea that if you just educate people enough, then they'll do the right thing.
Yeah, this is the perennial error of all forms of humanism and leftism, is the idea that man's only problem or issue or the way to fix man is to just spout at him more facts, right? If we just educate someone. This actually goes back to the Greeks. The Greeks the Greek philosophy, Hellenism is, and it probably goes back before that, but the idea that no educated man would choose wrongly. Oh, really? Yeah, have you ever heard of an evil genius? There's such a thing as an evil genius, which disproves this whole Hellenic idea that you just
mad scientist.
Yeah, you just need to educate someone and they'll choose rightly. We need more social programs. If we just had more social programs, you know what I mean? This is a scam. It's social programs are social engineering. That's what they are.
Yeah.
But to the average normie, they actually think that these programs are instituted to actually help people, which is kind of hilariously naive.
So even though Freud was determined to destroy every possible reason for accepting the spiritual worldview, he admitted that many of the great minds that he admired had been Christians. So
does he say who he admired?
Let's see. Isaac Newton, St. Paul.
Well, if Freud was a version of an incel, he was a god cell. Somebody said I could see
Well,
him. I could see him admiring Newton because Newton was a total incel.
I have the whole chapter on Freud's sexual history coming up.
Well, remember we're on YouTube, so we gotta go easy. We can't say anything.
Okay.
Speak in code.
So yeah, he admired.
You can
Isaac
speak of
Newton.
cigars.
St. Paul, Oscar Pfister. Do you know who that is?
What do you know the story of Bill Clinton and his cigar? Do you know that
Ew.
story?
Yuck.
How would Sigismund
dare you?
Freud interpret the story of Bill Clinton and the cigar?
How dare you bring up that YouTube?
How dare you?
How dare you?
I did not inhale. I did not like it. By the way, I just noticed today, I just BTFO'd Bill Clinton because how did he know he didn't like weed if he didn't inhale? Boom. Got him. See? See what I mean?
Yeah. Yup.
I just deconstructed with the power of my logics, the illogics of Mr. Clinton and his weed tail.
Do you know who Oscar Pfister is?
I do not.
A Swiss pastor and psychoanalyst who Freud admired.
Okay. Tell us about this dude.
Nothing really. You just
Was
said
he
who did
full of
Freud-
holes?
Yeah.
Get it? Swiss cheese?
Uh-huh. Let's see. They're talking here again about religious practices is just OCD, praying, counting, hand
It
washing.
is if you go to the SSPX. The Latin mass priests are all OCD.
Or like how the Jews like bob up and down when they pray. So Freud
thought all these things were like weird, obsessive.
Yeah.
They were like the
about
older
the-
versions of Spurger's stimming. Stem.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Interesting.
Let's see. So then we talk about chapter 3. Is there a universal moral law? If you have no moral point of reference, what you think is no more right or wrong than what I think. This is moral relativism. That's what the professor is opening with, right?
What professor? Freud or the guy writing the book?
No, the author.
Oh, okay. Yes, exactly.
So then questions of what should we ought to do? What is guilt? Is it a God-given feeling, or is there actual moral law? Freud thinks that...
Yeah, do we have a
codes,
conscience? Exactly.
Yeah. Freud thinks moral codes can change from culture to culture. Lewis says we discover the code as we discover the laws of mathematics, and this universal moral law transcends time and culture.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely. Hence, theism. Yeah.
An important difference between the views of Freud and those of Lewis concern epistemology, right?
So here we're getting into the worldviews and the branches. Remember, you've heard me say many, many times.
Yeah.
3 branches of philosophy. That's our worldview.
Epistemology, metaphysics, and
ethics.
What? Ethics, yes.
Good job. You don't. I learned you good.
You're a good teacher.
Thank you.
Freud thinks the scientific method is our only source of knowledge. And Lewis argues that the question of whether or not...
Basic bitch scientism. Easy to refute.
Yeah. Lewis argues that the question of intelligence can never be answered by the scientific method. Right. When one attempts to answer this question, he makes a philosophical or metaphysical assumption, not a scientific statement.
Exactly.
Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, the scientific method cannot justify the scientific method. And the scientific method attempts to restrict all reliable knowledge to the scientific method. So there you go.
So Lewis kind of advocates the combining of the moral law of the Old and New Testaments with our conscience.
Yeah, conscience is a reflection of the same moral principles that God has established, in nature and overall. Exactly.
And then he quotes the verse Jeremiah 31:33, I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. So it's not just from a book of codes. It's also in our bodies.
Yeah, Paul says this in Romans 1 and 2. Exactly.
Let's see. Lewis says that the moral law does not vary that much between culture to culture. It's basically the same. Selfishness has never been admired. People look up to, their heroes are people of honesty and selflessness and heroism, and, vice and degeneracy, for the most part, is not what is valued outwardly in a culture.
Yeah, there's a little bit of weakness here in this argument. I mean, the moral claim argument, the universality of morals argument is not that good of an argument. It's pretty weak. I do think that there is something there in the sense of you can talk about ethics as a necessary transcendental category to have a coherent worldview, but just the generic appeal to, well, everybody knows that, being heroic and having valor is good. They do, but only on the Christian paradigm, right? So you can't have a non-theory laden appeal to virtues. It doesn't work. So in a sense, I get what Lewis wants to do, but the move is not a valid move, and so it's not the best argument. He should tidy up that argument. It's not very good, but what he's after, we would agree with. But a savvy atheist can just kind of decimate that and point out that actually there's not a coherent universal moral that all cultures adhere to. You can say there is a universal moral standard, but you're going to have to justify it and make sense of that in a different way than appealing to a bunch of different cultures. It's not going to work.
So then they talk about natural law, the Tao, the first principles of practical reason, and
The
traditional
Tao,
morality.
like Taoism?
Yeah.
Okay.
But then I was thinking, if Freud's an atheist and there's no such thing as that your culture dictates what's right and wrong, then why is it right to be a Nazi? Like, if he hated Nazis and he had to run away from them, what made the Nazis wrong?
Yeah,
If
I mean,
their
this is
culture
that's
dictated
just
that,
I mean, that's just
this is
another form of
what is moral,
relativism.
they were just doing that.
That's just another form of relativism: moral relativism, cultural relativism, social relativism, epistemic relativism, subjectivism. They're all just variations of the same problem, and of course, they are completely incoherent and they are arbitrary. If morals are purely subjective, purely based on individual tastes, then there are no morals. It's just whatever anybody wants. And nobody actually lives that way, right? You can talk like you believe that all day long, but when the minute somebody steals your wallet, you're mad.
Exactly, yeah. If you're hurting me, you're bad. So Freud wrote, quote, ethics are remote from me. I do not break my head very much about good and evil. He said that he did not consider most people worth much, no matter whether they publicly subscribe to this or that ethical doctrine or not at all. Freud believed that education and establishing the dictatorship of reason would be the only solution to solving the cruel and immoral behavior that characterizes human history. So in his mind, it's the intellect and laws that establish a dictatorship. And he even wrote about this in a letter to Albert Einstein.
Yes, interesting. And we should note, as Chrysostom in the chat has noted, that this is another common fallacy that comes up. We mentioned it in the stream that we did with Tristan the other day about how prevalent fallacies are amongst the vegans. You'll find the same fallacies here, is that when people try to justify the moral claims, they'll say things like, well, I mean, most people agree that this is right or wrong. It's called the appeal to consensus fallacy. That's a fallacy.
Well, it's interesting at that in Freud's day, Germany, Nazi Germany, was one of the most educated countries in the world.
Yes.
So,
if he's going to have a problem with eugenics laws, on what basis, right? So it's just arbitrary. It's not consistent.
So Freud did not really believe in a conscience. He caught this was an internalized part of the parent, which he called the superego. So, the id, the ego, and the superego.
So my superego is just like my mom and dad, little mom and dad in my head telling me what's
yes,
going
it's
on.
just a little voice, and it's the voice of your parents.
The still small voice of my dad.
Freud thought of guilt as just a repressed desire, and if you were open, quote, open about things, that you need not feel shame.
That sounds like what the game he was probably spitting to his female clients. You know what I mean? Like, that's really just his...
We're going to get to that.
You need to be a little more open, baby. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, you're repressed. Let me help you out. Like, he sounds like a guru like all the other cult leader gurus that we talk about. Like, we just watched the Bikram yoga guy, right?
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, he's got the same shtick, right? Like, you need me to help you to relax. You are repressed. I will unrepress you. Give me your butt.
So the only thing that you should feel bad about is feeling bad.
Yes, exactly. And modern psychology adopts this. Hence, everybody losing their minds.
Yeah. So Freud measured his own morality, his moral code, on the conduct of others. So he believed that he was better than most people, so he was good enough. Right?
Yes.
And then in an interesting...
Maybe he was better than most people.
Counterpoint, C.S. Lewis talks about this attitude in the Screwtape Letters, where the demon uses...
that's another one. I forgot I read Screwtape Letters. Yeah, that's a classic. Everybody should read that. That's a good psychological book. I mean, it's not purely psychological, but it is psychological, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's about how to get people to go to hell.
Yeah, it's the demon is writing and explaining to his superior, and the superior writing back how to trick people. It's also relevant to like psyops too.
It says here, the book is about advice on how to help people on the road to hell. He tells what advantage the devils have when a person compares himself with others and develops the "I'm as good as you" attitude.
Exactly.
And he says a person's need to tell others that he is superior expresses the itching, smarting, writing awareness of an inferiority, which the patient refuses to accept. So just saying that I'm as good as anybody else.
I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. Remember that Silent Lock character? Yeah. So this I'm sure this gives rise to self-help and all that crap too, right?
Yeah, this actually comes from a feeling of worthlessness, they say. It says there's strong evidence to suggest that Freud struggled most of his life with clinical depression himself. He makes frequent mention in his letters, and he took cocaine for a number of years to find relief.
That's so meta. Now we're back to the beginning of the discussion. All we are is dust in the wind, dude.
Yeah, and then he goes, dust, wind, dude. And he blows it away. And Socrates is like, oh, you get it. So crazy. Back to the question of guilt. He said, we now know depressed patients often suffer pathological guilt.
By the way, confession. Isn't it interesting that once the sacrament of confession was dispensed with, the secular world all turned to their therapists, right? Their psychologists and their therapists. And I actually read an article by an Anglo-Catholic 10 years ago that was really, really good. In the New Oxford Review, I don't know why, I used to subscribe to somebody bought me a New Oxford Review subscription, and a guy wrote a great analysis of how psychiatry and psychology is just the secular replacement for having a spiritual father and a confessor. And it's so obvious. Yeah.
And having friends and confidants and family.
Yeah, I still don't have those, so I wouldn't know about that, but I definitely know. I'm joking.
I don't know if we're
Oh,
gonna
you mean
come
so?
up
Yeah,
to
well, I
this-
guess if you move to the city, you don't have real friends, and when you're in the degenerate cosmopolitan area, you just have like party friends and work people. And so I guess then you need the therapist because the therapist
Well,
is also your father figure, mother
I'm
figure,
kind of
whatever.
laughing at Freud thinking that he like discovered talk therapy and how this helps people when this is what women have been doing with each other since the beginning of
Talk
time.
therapy?
Like, yeah,
No, Dr. Phil discovered talk
Yeah.
therapy, Jamie.
like he thinks that he's onto something, that when I let people talk about their feelings, they feel better. And it's like women already know this, and we already do this all the time.
Yeah, but that's just because you're weak creatures who want reassurance from other weak creatures.
I know.
I'm just joking. Just a joke.
Oh, I don't know if this point is going to come up again, but they did make the point that the person who thinks that they're okay is farther off than the person who can see their own flaws.
Wait, who's making
And-
this point?
C.S. Lewis, I think, will maybe make that point a little later, that if you think that you're good, you are not as good as the guy who admits that he's not good.
Oh yeah.
And needs
Well, I mean, this is
God.
Jesus's point, right? The
Yeah.
sinner, the publican, and the Pharisee, right?
Yeah,
The man
exactly.
who those who think that they're well, are self-righteous.
Right.
Now, Jamie,
Here
you
we go.
need to speed this up a little bit because I'm
Okay.
detecting from you a little bit of animosity over that joke that Jay made about women being weak.
Is that what the chat said?
Are you saying the audience are a bunch of hoes?
Catch me outside. How about that?
What does that mean?
It means you're a bunch of hoes.
You're saying the audience are a bunch of hoes?
Yup.
Yup. Go ahead. I'm just
Let's see.
screwing out. I'm just joking.
Freud says civilization has little to fear from educated people. Yeah, right. Who live ethical lives because reason tells them it is in their best interest to do so.
Yeah,
So
I mean, so here we go. The
His
circular,
dictatorship-
the circular
Yeah.
argument of the secularists that, well, we just know what's right and what's wrong because reason tells us what's helpful and what's good. I mean, it's just a total dumb nonsense argument. Imagine if a theist made these kinds of arguments. Like how quickly the atheist would jump on that. Oh, BTFO theist. And then they turn around and do the dumbest arguments to justify their positions. We know what's right and what's wrong by just using reason and figuring it out, bro.
Oh, here I found the quote about good and bad. C.S. Lewis says, when a man is getting better, he understands more and more clearly the evil that is still left in him. When a man is getting worse, he understands his own badness less and less. A moderately bad man knows he is not very good. A thoroughly bad man thinks he is all right.
Is Dr. Phil a mix of Freud and Lewis, or is he more one or the other?
Dr. Phil is a saint.
Dr. Phil in the gaps.
And here again, Freud thought he was better than most people, so he was probably worse than most people.
Hot take.
Then we are getting into the great transition. What is real? Let's see here.
As in metaphysics? I mean, is that what this chapter is about?
What this is about conversion.
C.S. Lewis's conversion. Because Freud's still atheist, right?
Yeah, Freud was always atheist.
Right. Okay.
So we have Freud saying education facilitates morality, which is false. Freud saying it's guilt causes depression, but there are two ways to deal with guilt.
Okay.
Confession and repentance, which is the orthodox way, or acceptance, which is the carnal way to deal with guilt. Lewis's worldview and conversion change didn't happen until he was 31. It was gradual and intellectual, but it changed his whole personality. Freud wondered about the people who have never have an internal epiphany. So Lewis, like Paul had
NPCs, no internal dialogue.
Right.
Sort of. I know what you're talking about. People who don't ever have a crisis of conscience, existential question.
Yeah, so Freud blamed God for not revealing it himself and not making Freud believe in him. How weird is that?
Of course, if God did do that, it would be decried as a violation of free will, right? I mean, you can never win with these people. I mean, Jesus said even if one rises from the dead, they still won't believe. So,
yeah. Let's see. Yeah, so Freud was kind of butthurt that he never had his St. Paul moment to believe in God. But he did wonder if these types of stories are like epilepsy or seizures or like some kind of medical thing that they can explain now that they couldn't have explained back then.
That conversions are like having a
that
fit.
They're just episodes.
Having a fit, having seizures. Okay. Low IQ Freud.
One of my notes here says, "Seek and you shall find." So Freud wasn't really seeking God. He was trying to get away from him. So that's why he didn't find him. How can you prove God if your starting point is unbiased? Does that make sense?
Right. Who said this? Which one?
I did. That's one of my questions.
About Lewis or Freud?
About anybody. Like, how can you prove God exists if your starting point is unbiased? Is that possible?
Well, there is no unbiased starting point. All starting points are biased.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's not even possible,
no, it's
right?
not possible for anybody.
Okay. So Freud says, God has not done so much for me. He had never allowed me to hear an inner voice, and if in view of my age he did not make haste, it would be my fault if I remained to the end of my life what I was now, an infidel Jew.
By the way, I want to, somebody made a good point in the chat that Freud's sessions were essentially the opposite of confession. Yeah, I wasn't trying to say there's a one-to-one correspondence between. I just meant that from the vantage point of the person confessing, it's a psychological desire that all of us seem to have to want to relieve our conscience by talking to other people about the mistakes that we've made. And so from that side of it, yes. But you're right that I wasn't saying that like Freud is going to give you some kind of cigar-based absolution. He's just going to actually affirm all of your uncontrolled desires and tell you that you need to indulge in them more.
Mm-hmm. So this author also does studies about conversion in his college, right? And he gives questionnaires to his students, and we'll get to that in a second. But
so are we about to halfway? Where are you at in your notes?
Yeah, it's halfway, I guess.
Okay, so you want to give it another 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll call it an end to the halfway.
We can try and get through this. But he's saying about people who convert, they show a marked improvement in ego functioning, a radical change in lifestyle, an abrupt halt in the use of drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, improved impulse control, adoption of a strict sexual code demanding chastity or marriage with fidelity.
So hold on. So Freud is admitting that
this is the professor that
okay.
writing the book. So anybody who converts, all his students that have an experience at college, they go on
so an atheist will use these kinds of arguments often about, oh, my life is so much better now because when I adopted atheism, I have XYZ improved situation, so therefore that helps me know atheism is true. But when we find the converse to be the case, that people who accept theism when XYZ situation is better, that's always dismissed as, no, you just think it's better because you're a theist now. It's not actually better. So you'll notice that there's a selective bias as to what is accepted as a better well-flourishing life, depending upon the paradigm.
Yeah. So this whole laundry list of benefits
That
you
would
get.
be a version of perhaps Texas sharpshooter fallacy, where we are picking and choosing the evidence or interpreting the evidence based on what we want the conclusion to be. I think that would be Texas sharpshooter. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's just like a long list, like basically everything in your life improves, like a positive change in your relationships, a decrease in preoccupation with the passage of time, apprehension over death. It's just like this whole giant, like basically conversion leads to super increased functionality in your life.
Right.
So, page 97.
Yeah, but practical arguments are only useful against theism, you see, if you're an atheist.
Historical. Oh, okay. One of the most militant atheists at Oxford was friends with Lewis. His name was T.D. Weldon. And one night they were sitting in Lewis' room, and T.D. says, they're talking about the historical authenticity of the Gospels, and this atheist admitted that it was like airtight. And Lewis said, I immediately understood the implications. If this hardest boiled of all the atheists I ever knew thought the Gospels were true, where did that leave me? So even atheist students are saying that the historicity of the Bible is surprisingly sound.
Yeah, sometimes you'll get atheists that will admit that kind of stuff. I mean, they still don't. But I mean, that's another reason why the evidentialist apologetic is just limited and not really that sound of an argument, because I mean, I could admit that Jesus rose from the dead, so what? Weird things happen, right? I mean,
Well, that was just one of the things that started him on the
right.
path.
I know. I mean, in the process of people's lives, they do at times find arguments that are not that sound somewhat convincing. But they're only convincing if you already have the Christian presuppositions, or you believe in the possibility of the Christian worldview or presuppositions. Then they become a little more convincing. But again, you're going to read the evidences that you see through the paradigm that you have, through the glasses that you have. So I understand what you're saying, that this was a period in his life, but I'm just making the point that there's a mix of apologetic in C.S. Lewis, where at times he verges on transcendental arguments, and then at times he's just sort of spouting these kind of generic atheist, or these generic classical theist arguments.
Another thing that made an impression on him was that Lewis was an expert in mythology, and he concluded that the gospel was unique to all the other stories of gods and goddesses.
Yes. Other people have pointed this out in Genesis too. William Lane Craig, I'm not a huge fan of William Lane Craig, but he actually has one really good book that I do recommend on Genesis. His book, Creation Ex Nihilo. If you remember, we got that when we were in St. Augustine one time at a bookstore. I think he bought it for my birthday many years ago. I think it was like the first year I met you, 4 years ago. You bought me that book. Remember that? Yeah, so that book actually contrasts the Genesis narrative to the other mythologies of the ancient world, and it shows, I think, about 10 different points of distinction, and where the Genesis account is actually unique. Creation ex nihilo is unique, and you don't find that in the ancient world religions, especially not the ancient pagan mythologies. So I'm not surprised that you would also have that unique aspect in the gospel narrative as well.
Yeah. So Lewis said about the Gospels, he said, now, as a literary historian, I am perfectly convinced that whatever else the Gospels are, they are not legends. I have read a great deal of legend, and I am quite clear that they are not the same sort of thing. They are not artistic enough to be legends. From an imaginative point of view, they are clumsy. They don't work. Most of the life of Jesus is totally unknown to us, and no people building up a legend would allow that to be so. And so then he talks about how Jesus is different from every other moral teacher that claimed, like Muhammad or Confucius, Plato, Moses, Buddha, none of them ever made the claim that they were God.
Well, that's not actually true. Countless gurus have claimed to be God. So this, I would say, is a bad argument. I mean, again, I sympathize with what he's wanting to prove, but the argument is not very, very, very good. It's an invalid argument. I mean, the mere fact that there's similarities in religions doesn't prove or disprove anything. It's just a fact. And so the fact that you can find distinctive characteristics itself does not prove or disprove Christianity. Why would it? I mean, so what if there's distinct? I mean, I could make up a religion right now that's completely unique and distinct. It doesn't mean it's true. So now these facts are relative within the paradigms that we're comparing, right? So if an atheist is making the argument that, oh, Christianity is the same as all the religions, you can point out, no, it's actually not. There are several unique factors, but that just rebuts that claim. It doesn't actually prove that Christianity is true. Because I could come up with the most unique religion right now. Me and Bill Cosby and Lil Wayne are a trinity. And we are God. No one has proposed this religion before. It's so unique, dude. And we just created the world 15 minutes ago, and we gave everybody the idea that the world is, ancient. It's not. Me and Bill Cosby and Lil Wayne, as a triad, created this world 15 minutes ago, and we put it in your head that you've been here for aeons, or the world has been here for aeons. And by the way, give me super chats because I'm part of an evil triad with Bill Cosby and Lil Wayne. Tithe to me right now. You see what I'm saying? That's not, that's super unique, right? If uniqueness is what made things true, then my religion is the most unique, and therefore that's ridiculous. Right?
Yeah, I mean, these are not like super airtight arguments. It's just his experience.
I know. And I'm not, again, my point is just to point out that there's kind of like William Lane Craig. William Lane Craig will at times use transcendental argumentation. He doesn't really use the transcendental argument for God, but he'll incorporate transcendental arguments into his apologetic. Fesser does this too in his book right here, The 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. But so what? Like they're not good arguments. Anyway.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So the author's talking again about the conversion experiences of his undergraduate students that he researches. And he says, first, all the experiences occur within a context of modern liberal university where the climate tended to be hostile to such experiences. So it wasn't anything about the college they were at that was leading them to be converted. It was actually the opposite. They were converted in spite of that. He says, second, both Lewis and the students I observed have people in their lives they admire and some quality they found missing in their own life. And then third, both Lewis and his students made a conscious exertion of their wills to open their minds and examine the evidence.
Right.
And then a point I made here is that Freud and psychiatrists determine whether a patient needs treatment by the degree of impairment in functioning. Right? Like, how crazy are you? Does this affect your everyday life? Or, like, how bad is this making everything? And what we just were talking about was that conversion, rather than being some sort of detrimental psychosis, actually increases all of your functionality. So it's the opposite of mental illness.
Good point.
Yeah. So then we get to part 2. Do you want to save that?
Yes.
For next time?
So that'll be for Thursday. If you want to send a super chat, you can do the super chat time right now. Pay your tithe to the unholy trinity of Lil Wayne, Bill Cosby, and Jay Dyer.
This is really good, super juicy because now we're going to talk about happiness. Where does it come from? What is the source of our greatest enjoyment?
How do we find it? Yes.
Yeah, then we're going to talk about sex. Is the pursuit of pleasure our only purpose? And this one was a super interesting chapter about Freud.
You mean love, Jamie? Love.
Well, the next chapter is about love. So
love
the first
and
one
cigars.
Cigars
and
then love, and then pain and death.
Awesome.
So I hope you guys subscribe because it only always gets better in the second half.
Right.
We hit our stride in part 2 every time. So please don't miss that one.
All right, let's read these super chats. Tanner Terry for $10. He says, "Thank you for your work, brother." Thank you very much, Tanner Terry. Much appreciated. Thank you for all your support. You've been a long-time supporter. Shout out to Tanner Terry. Nathan Weston, $10. I'm in the Nashville area. Let's grab a beer sometime. Whoa, bro, hitting on me. He's hitting on me, y'all. I'm with my fiance. My fiance. Don't hit on me, bro. Let's grab a beer and talk about how you converted me to Orthodoxy. Well, I'm glad to hear that. I'm honored to hear that you are interested and converted to Orthodoxy. I'm wondering about your experience with the churches in this area. Are the Antiochians modernists? I would say the Serbian Orthodox Church in Nashville might be where you'd want to go, depending on your proclivities. But I don't think the Franklin Antiochian Church is modernist per se. It's been some time since I've been to that church, though. Palmer Elric, $10. Just trying to show some support for the quality content. You are showing it. You're showing it, dude. Much appreciated. Palmer, a longtime supporter. Shout out, shout out, shout out. We got James Plantagenet. Ooh, we got European elites, black nobility royalty up in the house. What's up? He says, "This is my tithe." Good. You have tithed to my most unique cult, where I am the third member of the evil triad. Thank you, James Plantagenet, for that $20 super chat. Russian anime bot says, "Take my KGB rubles." And Dugan gives you mystical occult Dugan blessing from underneath St. Basil's Cathedral in underground Soviet mystical Bitcoin base. And you will receive 1 zillion Soviet-backed Bitcoin for your generous donation of $3.99. Dugan says, "We love you." From Russia with love. Alfonso Corral for $10. "Here's my tithe, O great unholy trinity of Little John's holy words brought to you in your presence," especially when he says, "Yeah." Did I say Little John or Lil Wayne? I think I said Little John. That's actually better because in my mind I was thinking of Lil Wayne, but my joke was Lil John. But that's actually better because, anyway, Lil John is a funnier character. What? Yeah. Y'all like my Lil John impersonation? That's pretty good. Does it sound like him?
Oh, what?
Does it sound like him?
Do it again.
What? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Putin says that we are doing good work. Thank you. Thank you, Master Lord Putin. Anything else from you guys? I don't see any more super chats. So yeah, subscribe and we'll have this up Thursday. And by the end of the week, I'll have the final lecture on Genesis and we'll move into Exodus. So God bless everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Jamie, for this wonderful analysis. And we will do part 2 Thursday.
All right. Thank you. Bye.